minutes after footage emerged.
Okay, welcome to Tuesday night's Cross Question on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. If you'd like to phone in with a question, 0345 6060 973. That is the number to call. There's lots to talk about tonight. We've been covering a lot over the last hour. Joining me on the panel are Andrew Fisher, former Director of Policy for Jeremy Corbyn. Jonathan Romain is one of Britain's leading rabbis. And India Willoughby is here. She's a broadcaster. Stephen Hammond is voting in the House of Commons at the moment, but he will be joining us momentarily, I'm sure. You can watch us on Global Player. You can watch us on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk or indeed the LBC Facebook and YouTube feeds.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to Davida, who is in Preston. Davida, what would you like to ask?
I'd like to ask the panel, should the BBC boycott the 2022 Chinese Winter Olympics?
Well, that's one out of left field, isn't it? I wasn't expecting that to be the first question. The Americans are boycotting it from a diplomatic point of view. I'm not aware of any other broadcasters saying that they're going to boycott the Olympics. India Willoughby, what do you think?
Yes, I think they actually should, but I don't think they will, sadly. I think China's record, human rights and all the other things that have been going on, is, as most people would feel, quite despicable. And I think it's about time that big organisations did start taking a stand. But is it right for Britain's national broadcaster, which is supposedly impartial in everything, should take a stand on something like this? Yes, I do. Because some things you cannot be impartial on some questions. One that's very close to my heart. Another one would be racism. We're not going to be impartial on racism. So why should we be impartial on China? I think it's about time that big organisations did take a stand against this. And quite frankly, China is now a force on a global scale, the geopolitical scale, where nobody will stand up to it. And I think that sport is important. We've seen in the past it's been used where stands have been made. I remember South Africa in the 1980s when the cricketers and the footballers went along, and that supported apartheid. It aided what was, quite frankly, an evil regime. And I would like to go to a stage where people did make a stand against it.
I can sense Jonathan shaking his head next to me.
Yes, I agree 100% that it's a vile regime, what it does to the Uyghurs, to so many people, to political dissidents. It's a horrendous thing, and it must be horrible to live in China. I'm so glad I'm not. But it's, of course, a dilemma that comes up every, 12 years, doesn't it, when we have a country we don't like. And actually, there are benefits in going, because it does help to open up the country a little bit, to expose it. We saw that with Russia as well. The country transformed itself. And although it sort of closed down again after the Olympics, there was a knock-on effect. And also, I feel really sorry for the athletes who train, not just for 4 years, but 15 years to go for it. So I think we should be there.
Well, to be fair, Davida is not saying that the athlete should boycott. It's saying that the BBC should boycott.
Yes, I don't see why the BBC should bother. I think actually the government's got it right at the moment, which is that the diplomats, which represents the government, should boycott it, but not the athletes, and that will send a message. I think if we turn off the television, then what do we achieve? I think we denude ourselves, and also, of course, there's no reason why the television can't make references to the fact, there are no Uyghurs in the team or whatever. We can have a commentary. We can expose China to the gaze of the wider world. So it's a horrible regime. It's always a moral dilemma. But I think the government's probably struck the right balance.
I'm just thinking about that phrase, exposing China to the gaze of the wider world. Oh, gaze, G-A-Z-E, you meant.
Yes.
And
you can take it both ways. I'm happy with that.
So to speak. Andrew?
my view, I guess, is that it's not for the BBC to decide that. I think when there were boycotts of the 1980 and 1984 Olympics, the BBC broadcast both. It wasn't a matter for the BBC. I think really it's up to the government on what the England or UK, in the Olympics decision would be. We've also got the World Cup in Qatar, which is an equally, perhaps not equally, but an also despicable human rights abusing country. We've had the Winter Olympics, as Jonathan said, and the Summer Olympics, I think, wasn't it, or the World Cup as well, in Russia in recent years. So I think it's unfair on the athletes involved, not because they wouldn't be going, but because then people at home wouldn't be able to watch them. And I think that's an odd thing to boycott. So I sympathise with the kind of moral stance against China or Qatar or any other human rights abusing regime, but I don't think that's the right solution.
Stephen Hammond has joined us. Let me just repeat the question for you, Stephen. Should the BBC boycott the Winter Olympics in China?
So I think the question here is very clearly what influence or what would that impact would that have on what is everybody is. I've heard Andrew say quite right, it's a despicable regime, and I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. The question is, if we do boycott it, will it have any value? Will we achieve anything by it? And I think that's the first point, because it's no just doing. I'm not a great believer in just doing it for the point of making a tokenism. I think that it is pretty clear that there are other things that if you wanted to make that point to the Chinese regime, which is some of the financing of projects, which would actually hurt them more than actually something like this. But I also agree. I don't think it's really for the BBC to make that decision. If the government wishes to go further, then that will be a decision they have to take. But at the moment, both government officials, diplomats are all going to boycott, and I think that's probably the sensible...
Can I also say there's also the trap that we think very piously about boycotting or not at the Olympics, and then it's gone. And actually, if we're really bothered by what's happening in China, it should be a continuum, and we should...
What about the fact that the Americans are not sending any diplomats to these Winter Olympic Games? Should we follow suit in that?
Yes, I think that is a good signal, and also we should, as consumers, we have a certain power. Are we going to buy Chinese goods? Are we going to go on holiday there? We also have power as individuals, so if we feel strongly about it, don't ask our athletes to represent us. We ought to represent our own political views.
Davida, what do you think?
Well, I think the BBC take every opportunity to virtue signal, so to me it seems a bit hypocritical to garner millions of viewers by showing games coming from such a despicable regime that is basically held accountable internationally for genocide.
OK, David.
Should they have boycotted the Grand Prix in Saudi Arabia then as well? I mean, how far do you go?
Yeah, Channel 4 should, yes, yeah. Because
we're not going to get any sport on our TV at all if you.
But I'm actually, I think he's raising a really good point here, Davida. You can't have your cake and eat it. And what we basically seem to be saying here is that because it's sport and people have, put in a lot of effort to take part, we should turn a blind eye because it so happens that this particular event this year is in a vile country, a vile regime. I don't think you can do that. You've got to make a stand on these issues. And the other danger is as well, you're basically playing up and grandizing the regime. You are giving them a platform and a respectability to the world.
I think the failure here is on the International Olympic Committee and FIFA that has agreed for these countries to host it. I actually think the moral failure is with them. I don't think they should have awarded the World Cup to Qatar. I don't think the Olympic Committee should be awarding the Olympics to different countries like that. I think that's where the pressure point's got to come. I think then to blame the BBC or argue over what level of diplomat or the government should ban, I think is getting into the weeds. The bigger problem here is the original decision, and I think taking on that I think is the right thing. And the same with Formula One and Saudi Arabia. Absolutely.
Right, let's move on. David's in Enfield. Hello, David. David.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Does the panel agree with Ian Blackford that Boris Johnson has demonstrated himself to be a liar?
I suppose you're making oblique reference to the Christmas party video that's come out today, and indeed the letter that's been released, that's been leaked by his PPS about the animals and the evacuation of Afghanistan. Andrew Fisher.
I mean, it's hard to know which specific example it could be being referred to. There's so many. I mean, yes, he has, unfortunately. And I think, politicians often get accused of lying or all being liars, and I think that can be quite damaging. I think the thing is with Boris Johnson is he does it time and time again, and when he is picked up on it, he doesn't apologise, he doesn't correct the record, he just blusters on and carries on. And I think that is quite unique, actually, in politics. All politicians make mistakes, and often they will come to the House, correct the record, they have Hansard corrected or so on. That does happen. That doesn't seem to be happening with Boris Johnson or his current cabinet. And I think, Ian Blackford and Dawn Butler previously, who's been fairly hot on this, are right to call it out, because I do think it's damaging to democracy, and it's corrosive if people just don't admit when they're wrong, even if it is an innocent mistake initially.
Stephen Hammond, when you look at this video, which I'm sure you're aware of now, that features Allegra Stratton, it's 4 days after the Downing Street Christmas party that Boris Johnson now says didn't happen, but it clearly did. What else are people to call Boris Johnson, if not a liar, when he comes out with these outright denials that turn out to be complete fiction?
Well, I think there will be real pressure on Number 10 tonight to clear up the story. You can't say there wasn't a party, because there clearly was. Everybody else, as far as I'm aware, obeyed the rules, or most of people did. I certainly did, and I share a sense of shock that it was allowed to happen, whether he was there or not. It's clearly there's clearly been, if we're at our most generous, misinterpretation of what actually happened. But frankly, now there is real pressure on Number 10 to come out and absolutely clear up what happened, clear up what action they're going to take. Otherwise, unfortunately, it will be another incident where, somewhat like the Dominic Cummings escapade to Barnard Castle, which will undermine trust in the government.
Well, give me a comment on this. Number 10 have issued a statement tonight. They're still sticking to the line that this Christmas party did not take place, despite this leaked video, which clearly proves that it did. They say there was no Christmas party. COVID rules have been followed at all times. I mean, do they take us for fools?
Well, Ian, you just heard what I said. I'm pretty clear that anyone who's seen that video, it must only lead to the conclusion that there was a gathering. So if you don't want to call it a party, don't call it a party. But it was clearly a gathering. Wine and eats have clearly
the
taken place.
Secret Santa presents, for goodness sake.
No, I'm not just. I
know you're not. I know you're not.
I'm not here. I am here. I am basically saying, as you've heard me say, that I think I share the disappointment that Number 10 haven't been clearer about it. I think they need to come out and clear it up, because otherwise trust in the government and trust in all politicians gets undermined.
As a Conservative MP, do you know anybody who attended the party?
No, I don't.
You don't, right.
I mean, I think
as I understand it, was a staff party inside Number 10. I'm not a member of the Number 10 staff, and I'm not a member of the government.
And special advisors. There were rumours that one or two very senior journalists were there, which I think is possibly why it didn't emerge in the first place. Yeah. Jonathan?
Well, I don't know about you, David, but when I was little, I was always told as a boy, if you do something wrong, you should own up. And yes, you'll get into trouble, but you will get into so much trouble if you try and hide it and then deny it afterwards. And it's just so stupid. And also, speaking as someone who's not party political, it just seems so ridiculous to let a trivial incident like this derail what are potentially other good policies, important areas like prison reform or drug reform, and suddenly we're talking about Christmas parties, and it's such an own goal.
James, do you want to come back? Sorry, David, do you want to come back?
Yes, I'm a traditional Conservative. I'm not a supporter of Boris Johnson. I felt that all the adults left the Conservative Party in the pre-Brexit putsch night of the long knives. However, these people in public life are supposed to be governed by certain principles, and the Nolan principles of public life. And number 6 on the list is honesty, saying that politicians must tell the truth, and if they don't, it's going to bring the whole system into disrepute. So I do believe that he's been, how can I say, dishonest, if not a liar.
David, thank you very much for that. Do you remember that phrase?
Economical with the truth.
That's the one, with the actuality, I think was the actual phrase, wasn't it? Well, that was to do with the Spycatcher case and Sir Robert Armstrong, the Cabinet Secretary, going over to Australia, wasn't it? Happy days. Right, we'll take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. It's 16 minutes past 8.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
19 minutes past 8 on LBC. Let me reintroduce you to our panel. Andrew Fisher is on my immediate right. No, actually the far right. Never been described as that before, have you, Andrew? It's Jeremy Corbyn's former Director of Policy. Rabbi Jonathan Romain is to my immediate right. To my immediate left, India Willoughby, and far left, Stephen Hammond, Conservative MP for Wimbledon, and also former Health Minister, and many other ministers. You was Transport Minister. Anything else you'd like to put in as evidence?
Part of the time at DCLG as well.
Well, there you go. Right, let's go to another question. It's kind of related to our last question. A good follow-up one from James in Chester. Hello, James.
Hiya, good evening. Good evening, Ian, and good evening, panel. How much more sort of lies, scandal, manipulation, deceit, dishonesty can the Conservative Party sort of peddle, and how much more can they take? Because it seems to me that the Conservative Party is falling at the seams, and, you know, you sort of asked, you know, what do we call Boris Johnson? You know what I mean? I call Boris Johnson now Baldrick from Blackadder, because he hasn't got a clue. He doesn't know, you know what I mean? He just hasn't got a clue, and I mean, that the disaster, I think, at the business meeting, when he was searching around for the speech and fumbling around, and I was just watching it thinking, oh my God, this is our Prime Minister.
Okay.
What this will say to the rest of the world. and then he goes on rambling about Peppa Pig.
All right. Stephen Hammond, Boris Johnson needs a Baldrick-style cunning plan, doesn't he, to get himself out of this? Because the problem is that, I may be wrong on this, but I think this video is maybe too early to say, but people remember things like that, don't they? And it just has the echoes of John Major's government in the 1990s, one thing after another. Well,
I think, as I said in an earlier answer, Ian, it feels to me like it could be similar to the Barnard Castle in terms of power with the public, and the public do remember that. But in answer to the question, I think the reality is the Prime Minister actually needs to reset his government, and part of that is I think that he needs to stop having around him too many people who say yes and not enough people who say no, and actually tell him some of the ideas simply won't wash and aren't acceptable. Because there are a number of good things that the government is doing, and the trouble is they get drowned out, as Jonathan said a moment ago, they get drowned out by stupidity, self-inflicted own goals. And really what the Prime Minister, I think, needs at the moment is probably some really toughening up of his operation inside Number 10, but particularly someone, an honest friend who can say no to him, stop him doing one or two of the things that he occasionally does. And then, we'll see a chance for the government to talk about what are really important things to people, like prison reform, like drug reform, like creating more jobs for people, like facing the problems of the economy post-COVID and skilling up and how we're going to do that. And that's really what we should be talking about in 2022, not about a Christmas party. But rather like you, I fear that this will be dominating the news for the next few days.
Laura Koonsberg has just tweeted, flavour of Tory reaction to the video from a minister, it's appalling. Another MP, it's indefensible. Another, oh God, I like Boris, but he needs some grown-ups in there. That wasn't you, was it, by any chance? India is not denying it.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, actually. And I actually think it's time up. The tectonic plates have shifted. I think in politics, sometimes it doesn't really matter. You reach a stage when so many cock-ups and mishaps have occurred and failures that people are just sick to the teeth of it, and they've changed their minds and they've had enough of that particular government. And I think that's the territory we're now in with Boris Johnson. I even get the feeling, and I'm speaking here as somebody who actually voted Conservative last time, primarily, like a lot of people from the north, to get Brexit done, because I think that was something that was missed by the media, predominantly in the south of England. They all thought that people were swapping to Conservatives for other reasons, when it was primarily about Brexit. But now that has actually been achieved, the Conservatives don't really serve much function for people up north where I'm from, Newcastle, Tyne and Wear, Cumbria, those areas. And when I go back to those places, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the government. And I just think this catalogue of chaos that has accrued, they just look like clowns. And I cannot see, even if they swap Boris for somebody else, which I expect them to do before the next general election. I do. I think their situation is irredeemable. I think it's more a question of Labour either getting their act together or whether they're actually going to go and have a progressive alliance with perhaps the Greens and come in.
Andrew Fisher, the benefit of the doubt is an ignored quality in politics. Jeremy Corbyn never had it from the electorate. Boris Johnson is losing it, possibly. And Keir Starmer might well benefit from this, because a lot of people may well think, well, he can't be worse than this lot, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
I think I agree with India. It's becoming cumulative. There are just so many things now, and whilst any one individual one didn't really break through, whether it was Barnard Castle, there was a blip in the Tory polling and then it picked back up once that was out of the way. It feels to me like we're getting close to a sort of almost tipping point where that support just won't bounce back. You know, you can only bounce back from so many things, I think, as a government or an opposition, actually, come to that. And you know, look, I'm partisan in this. I'm a Labour member. I hope it has reached that tipping point. It should have done. There have been so many things, and I hope this last one, just because they've spent so many days denying it, and so many government ministers on the telly saying, the party never happened. All the rules were complied with. Well, if it didn't happen, then there were no rules to be complied with about the party. So I think they've got themselves in a real mess over this now. This video, I think, is damning. I think you're right, Ian. And it's often said that, governments don't, oppositions don't win elections, it's governments that lose them. And that was probably true in sort of 92 to 97 in that parliament, I think, very much so, because actually when John Smith died in 94, the Labour was 20 points ahead. The Conservatives had collapsed then because it was all about the ERM fiasco and so on. So it can happen.
You're far too young to remember that.
I'm not far too young to remember that. I'm older than I look, Ian, I'm afraid. But I think the thing for Labour is it's got to, as well, give people something positive to vote for as well. And I think that's what's been lacking, which is why you've seen the Conservative numbers come down. They're now consistently under 40 and, in the mid to late 30s. But for that to kind of go further and actually switch to Labour, Labour's got to offer something a bit more, and I think got to be more on their game. And, maybe that will happen, but at the moment it hasn't happened enough. And I think that's why people are cautious. So you're definitely seeing a slip away from the Conservatives, whether it consolidates around Labour or in some areas to the Liberal Democrats, who are, again, I don't think are being particularly well led at the moment either. I don't think they're being a particularly forceful third party in England. I don't know, but Labour can't. I don't think Labour should kind of coast along thinking it'll all fall into our laps because the Conservatives are imploding. That may happen, but you can't bank on it. You've got to offer something positive as well.
Jonathan Romain.
I think it's actually too early to write off Boris Johnson or the Conservatives, actually, because you're right. There are these iconic moments. You mentioned John Major. I thought you were going to go on and say Gordon Brown and the awkward lady in the taxi, or Ed Miliband and the ham sandwich. But actually, I think a lot of people discounted Boris when they voted Conservative. They actually knew he was a bit of a lad, a clown, whatever you want to do. And also, I think we're too early on in the electoral cycle. There was, another 2 years to go? And what will really count is the economy. And if in 2 years' time people feel the economy's on the up...
It's actually 3 years to go.
3 years. Yeah. And if in 3 years' time some of the living up policies work, if they do, then people will say, OK, he's a bit of a lad, but we'll still vote Conservative. And I think it's going to always be the economy and people's sense of personal well-being, and they will discount Boris at the top.
Well, that's an interesting one. Do you agree with that, Stephen?
Well, I certainly agree with the point it's not irredeemable. I mean, I think the question for both government and opposition to answer next year is what is the point of them after COVID? And just as I said earlier, the sort of things I want to see, I think there are a lot of people in the Labour Party asking, what does the Labour Party stand for at the moment? What would it do if it were in power? And that's not at all clear. So, I absolutely don't think it's irredeemable. I absolutely think that the Prime Minister could still pull this round. And part of it will be the economy. Part of it will be, I think, the levelling up agenda. I hear different stories from colleagues in the North. You might say, India, that they're bound to say that, but I hear a very different story to some of what you've just said. And I also think that the Prime Minister has the one quality that politicians want, which is luck half the time. And, he's seen that on several times. He may well be losing it at the moment.
He's riding his luck at the moment.
He's riding his luck. But,
is there... I mean, we all know the Conservative Parliamentary Party is one of the most vicious beings in the... And if they detect that a leader is not an electoral asset, they get rid of the leader. Do you detect any of that going on at the moment?
Well, I think there have been... I mean, I would be foolish to say I don't think there have been... that I have clearly heard one or two rumblings, but I think it's cumulative, and I don't think there's any point that at the moment we're nowhere close to that sort of major discussion going on behind the scenes.
Do you know if
there is frustration?
Do you know of anyone who's written a letter to Sir Graham Brady?
I don't know of anyone who's written to me. I've read the rumours like you have that some have been submitted, but I don't know anyone personally who's written.
Because that, India, is the key to this. That's the way it works, that Conservative MPs would have to do the dirty deed. And I think it would be almost on a level of Margaret Thatcher being toppled. OK, she was. But I don't know if anybody disagrees with, I can't see that happening at the present. I mean, it could happen in 6 months or 12 months. No, I just can't.
I disagree, and I would class myself actually as a floating voter. I voted for the three big parties that we have in Britain over the years. So I'm up for grabs. Whichever party makes a good pitch for me, I will give them my vote. I just sense at the moment, because it has been so bad, just the last 2 years have been horrific, really. When you think, the care homes crisis, the handling of the COVID contracts, all of these things, and then you add on the clownish aspects like the speech he gave last week, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. I think the serious politicians within the Conservative Party are going to look at that. They're going to look at his track record as a human being, his personal life, his life as a journalist before that.
Yeah, but the Labour Party have tried to invoke that at every single election that he's fought, and they failed at every point to land a blow on him.
But Iain, Conservative voters by nature, the word Conservative, everything Boris stands for is not Conservative, really, in a small Conservative way, is he? He's not a family man, I wouldn't say.
He's got quite a few of them.
He's got quite a few. All of his behaviour.
You're rather defeating your own argument there, aren't you, India? Anyway, look, we're going to move on from this, but we are going to return to it at 9 o'clock for our 9 o'clock phone-in. If you have views on this leaked video, if you don't know what we're talking about, just look it up. It is quite stupendous. Nick says, your guests are not getting how big this is tonight. It really might bring him down. Well, you may be right, Nick, but I think it might take a little bit more than this. 8:32 is the time on LBC. Let's get the latest news headlines from Andy Ivey.
Downing Street has again insisted there was no Christmas party there last year, despite footage emerging showing senior number 10 aides apparently joking about a gathering during lockdown. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the Prime Minister has not been straight about the alleged gathering. The top civil servant at the Foreign Office has admitted he was on holiday during most of the chaotic evacuation effort in Afghanistan in August. Sir Philip Barton told a committee of MPs it had been a mistake for him to have stayed on leave during the crisis. The first cases of the Omicron variant of coronavirus have been confirmed in Northern Ireland. All 3 are linked to travel from Britain. LBC weather, tonight heavy rain and snow clearing northwards across Scotland, elsewhere clear spells and blustery showers. Tomorrow it'll be cloudy with showers or longer periods of rain, remaining windy for many, a high of 9 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:36. Alison in St Albans is one of our more cynical listeners. She says, you mentioned Boris riding his luck. Remember, there'll be a new baby in number 10 soon. Everyone loves a new baby, and Boris will ride that warm emotion as well. No one will move against him at that time. Well, you may be right. Now, with us on the panel, Rabbi Jonathan Romain, Stephen Hammond, Conservative MP, broadcaster India Willoughby, and former Director of Policy for Jeremy Corbyn, Andrew Fisher. Let's go to Anthony in Staines, who's got a very different question. Hello, Anthony.
Oh, hello, Ian. Hello, everyone, and shalom to you all.
Hi.
May I just put this question to you? After the recent Hanukkah bus attack and a general rise in anti-Semitism, is it time that we taught Hebrew to children in school and generally taught more about the Jewish faith to school children?
Every school? You want Hebrew taught in every school?
Well, it's the root of our culture, our language, really. We're learning about the Greek alphabet at the moment, but it all comes from the same root.
OK. Jonathan, let's come to you first.
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with your solution, but I understand the problem. In other words, actually teaching Hebrew, I'm not really sure if that would actually solve anything. But what you're really talking about is teaching greater understanding, greater tolerance. And there I would agree with you 100%. And of course, what happened in Oxford Street and this sort of 3 or 4 yobs shouting abuse at the bus was horrible. Although I have to tell you, what worried me just as much was the 30 or 40 people around who did nothing and who didn't try and intervene or whatever. So that, it's the old story of those who stand by, lead to problems. And yes, of course, there are these incidents, but I still actually rejoice in the fact that we are a multi-faith society. And if you were asking this question 30 years ago, Judaism or even Islam and Hinduism would not be taught at schools, whereas now virtually every school in their RE does mixed faith education. And I spent half my life actually showing schools around the synagogue, going to scout groups or church groups, and talking about our different faiths, our different ways, and of course what we have in common. And yes, there's still a way to go, but it's that interpersonal contact, it's the knowledge that really is going to sort of eventually have a more tolerant society.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Jonathan said. I think the only thing I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you on, but I think I'd just issue a word of caution. I think, look, I saw the I think it was phone recorded footage, wasn't it, of the attack, which was horrible. But I'd have some sympathy for the 30 or 40 people who were walking by, not because they weren't a group of 30 or 40, they were individuals or perhaps couples. And to stand up to 4 people who are being very aggressive is putting yourself at risk as well. And yes, of course, the brave thing to do is to do that. But I can understand why people...
You'd like to thought 1 or 2 of them might have done.
You would have done. No, look, I totally agree. And look, I've intervened in situations that have been violent in pubs, or aggressive at least in pubs and clubs and so on in my younger days.
6'6". Actually, if you're watching, he's 5'2".
I was going to say I'm close to 5'6", actually, but probably about 10 stone sopping wet as well. But look, I say this now as a father of 2 kids. I do think about, well, actually, do I want to put myself in harm's way now? And I would be more cautious. I think when you're younger, you're slightly more gung ho. You don't think you do intervene. And yes, I wish somebody had intervened, and it was obviously horrible for the children. I think on the exclusively children on the bus. But I also think I hope they catch the people. Their faces were very clearly shown on that footage. I don't know if they have been, actually. I haven't looked at any of the follow-up reports. But, I think Jonathan's absolutely right. My son, goes to school and he's been learning about every faith. He's probably got better knowledge than I have, because when I went to school, I learned about Christianity with maybe a sort of quick half hour on every other religion at the time. And that's only, 30 years ago. So... it has transformed, and I think that's really positive that children nowadays are learning about every other faith and are learning to be more tolerant, and that's a really positive thing. And I live in an area where my son goes to a school where I think 85% of children are not white British. It's a really diverse area, and that's really positive. And there aren't any tensions in my local neighbourhood and so on, and I think that's true for most of London. It is an incredibly successful multicultural environment, and yes, there will always be the odd idiot or for
Why don't we hear
behaving
about
like that.
that success a bit more than we do? Because we always concentrate on the things that go wrong. Inevitably, there will be tensions in some places, but we don't really hear about the places which do rub along quite nicely together.
Yeah, I think it's quite sad that we don't, but it's really good that Jonathan said, how much interfaith dialogue you have and how much you talk to schools and so on, and that's, I think, really positive.
Yeah, we used to talk about the New York, the Big Apple, being the melting pot. Actually, it's London.
Yeah.
It really is.
India.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think I'm not sure I would be in favour of including Hebrew as a compulsory lesson in schools, but I'm all for learning about the Jewish race and the Jewish history. My great-grandma Moses... Is it a race?
I set another hair running here, haven't I?
Well, we always debate, are we a race or are we religion? And the answer is neither. We're not a race because you can become Jewish, and we're not a religion because there are lots of Jews who are atheists.
And that's exactly why we need education in schools, because I'm showing my ignorance there, but I would love to learn more about Judaism and the history. As I say, my great-grandmother, I don't actually know the story, what actually happened. My great-grandmother, Moses, and obviously I'm not religious now, but there was Jewish blood in our family. So yeah, I think it's a great idea in that way. But what I would say, I think sometimes I don't think the public are actually aware of what is anti-Semitic all the time. It's not as easily recognisable as racism if it was a black person or an Asian person. And I think that education, if we had that with children growing up and people were more aware of it and could spot it, that might help.
Stephen.
Sounds like an outbreak of unanimity here, actually, which is probably what you don't want on this programme. But I mean, the teaching of greater understanding and greater tolerance, as Jonathan said, has to be key. I wouldn't agree with the questioner about teaching Hebrew, but the greater tolerance, the greater understanding. Yeah, and to Andrew's point, I mean, when I was at school, which was probably 5 or 10 years before him, the only thing that ever was taught was Christianity. None of the other religions were mentioned at all. And you think about how Britain has changed in the last 40 years, to the point that, London is the great multicultural centre of the world, and we should be proud of that. But it's quite easy for these things to slip, and we therefore, good people have to keep standing up and saying, let's teach it, let's teach understanding. This is not acceptable. And I think that's been the key message of the last few years.
I was talking to one of your colleagues, a fellow MP, and he said that he's of an age, and he said when he was at school, it was a Catholic school, they did do other religions, but in the heresy class.
If one was being frivolous, I wonder how much of that has changed.
Well, no, he said it very seriously, believe me.
Yeah, no, I know. But
Anthony, would you like to come back?
You said something about learning Hebrew, because it's a good mental exercise, because you read right to left, and it's a good sort of mental skill to learn, because I can read both ways. I can read Arabic as well, and I think it'd be beneficial to children to learn something different.
Well, it's a point of view. Not sure that I agree with that. Anthony, thank you very much indeed. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put your questions to our panel. We'll be off for a couple of minutes debating whether Stephen Hammond really is only 5 years older than Andrew Fisher. It's 8:45.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab. Some of the newspapers this morning. Afghans killed as Whitehall worked from home. This is, of course, when you were imposed as Foreign Secretary. The suggestion that it was dysfunctional, chaotic. How do you respond to that?
I'd point to the fact that in just 2 weeks, we secured the evacuation of 15,000
Well, how many more might you have done if it wasn't so dysfunctional?
I think if the criticism is that it took hours, not days, not weeks, hours to make decisions, given the importance and the sensitivity and the complications, I would suggest that was a reasonable approach to take.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
It was
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:48, a text question from Pauline in Durham. Hundreds of homes are still without power up here in the north. Does it show the government simply doesn't care about those outside London? Well, India, you are the nearest thing we have to... Well, you are a northerner, aren't you? A northeasterner, so you probably feel a lot of empathy with people in this situation. I think 500 homes a week later still don't have power.
That's right, yes. It's quite dire in the northeast, particularly at the moment, from what I hear from friends and relatives up there. So, good question, Pauline. Does the government still value the north after the election? My personal opinion is that we're going back to the norm now because of Brexit, harking back to what I said earlier on in that question. I think the north is back in the mood that London and Westminster doesn't really value anything north of Watford probably as much as it did during the run-up to the election. It's very disappointing that we're now a week on and so many families up there. We're talking hundreds as well. It's not just one little pocket of the northeast. Hundreds and thousands, maybe even 1,000 homes up there without power.
But it's not the government's responsibility, is it? Because all of the energy companies are in the private sector. So what should the government have done that they haven't done? Well,
they should be speaking about it and they should be making waves. When you look at the coverage that this has had, I didn't hear it mentioned on the news tonight, for instance. If this had been London, if this had been happening...
We spent 7 minutes covering it in our first hour.
Well, it certainly wasn't on the TV news that I saw tonight.
I'm not responsible for that.
But the point being, and I think this is what Pauline will be driving at, is that if there was as many homes without power for as long in London, this would probably be the top story in the country, or vying for top spot. And it's not.
Stephen?
The unanimity is probably finished now at this point. I mean, I don't think that's right as well, partly because the government has done all that it can do, which is it's deployed the army up there. It clearly has made a number of comments. It's clearly pushing the energy companies behind the scenes. I don't know why the technical problem, but it is a huge scar that it hasn't been sorted out a week later. But I don't think you can draw the conclusion from that the government doesn't care about the north of England. I just don't think the two things are similar. The fact of the matter is that the government, the private sector does need to get its act together, these energy companies. I don't know why it's taken so long. I mean, I'm not technical. There may be a very good technical reason, but it's not. That doesn't excuse the problem. But I don't think you'd see a different reaction if 1,000 houses in my constituency were down because it was hit by the storm. If it can't be done that quickly, it can't be done that quickly. And I don't think you could draw that conclusion.
One of your constituents has just texted, Joanne in Wimbledon. Stephen Hammond is my MP. I'm a Labour voter. Don't get many of them to the pound in Wimbledon, do you?
You do.
You do.
12,500 at the last general election.
more than I thought. Anyway, she says, I must say he's a good local MP and his office always get back to me if I email. Also, I'm impressed with him on your show tonight. Still a Labour girl, though. You've got a bit of a way to go to persuade Joanne.
Yeah, well, I think most MPs would take the view that someone from the other side thinks they do try hard for their local community, even if it's to persuade them on the vote.
Hard. Andrew.
Well, and gets results, obviously.
Yeah. I think it tells us two things. One is, even when you privatise what are basic services, the essentials in life, you never transfer the risk. The government will always be held responsible. If the trains don't run on time or are cancelled, the government's to blame. If the energy, if you can't get energy into your home, the government's to blame. Quite rightly. The government is there to kind of be responsible for us. We elect them to rule, to govern. And if they're not regulating the energy companies, having privatised them, which obviously I think was a mistake, then at the end of the day, the government does have to do that. They are there to represent us, and if we haven't got basics like energy during winter, then that is a government responsibility. You can't just say, it's all the private sector's fault. And I think governments have learnt this every time. When a rail franchise collapses, the government just don't go, that's the market, or stand back.
But
they step in and run
the rail industry was the nationalised part. The reason why the rail industry is failing is that the nationalised part of the rail industry is failing to deliver the infrastructure for the privatised companies.
That's a lack of public investment, though, and that was carrying on all the way through Thatcher's period. She defunded the railways, and they were cut over a number of years. British Rail was incredibly innovative. It was an incredibly efficient public service. Yes, it was.
Not my memory of it.
No,
well,
it's backwards.
No, it was not. I mean, if you look at actually some of the technology that's now being advanced in other countries, like the electromagnetic trains you have in China and Japan, that was technology that was funded here in the UK, in UK universities through British Rail. So, there was all kinds of funding arrangements. The Intercity line, which was the last publicly owned train, was publicly funded. So, which was one of the fastest in the world at that point. So that's not entirely true.
Jonathan?
I take a different lesson, actually, that it just shows how vulnerable we are to nature. And, we think we build all these houses and wonderful roads and motorways, but we try and tame nature, but we still fall victim to it, whether it's storms or hurricanes or tsunamis. And also how dependent we are on external sources for power. And that's sort of a little bit dangerous in a way, because it means we're reliant, and if it goes like it does, we're completely stuffed. And it also worries me that if a hostile power is able to knock out our electric grid or whatever, then boy, are we in trouble.
Well, there's another question. Neil has texted to say, I'm sick of these whinging northerners. They choose to live in remote villages. The terrain of the south is quite different. I was brought up in Scotland and we regularly had winter power cuts. It's nothing to do with the government anyway. It's the private energy companies. It's wrong, of course, and they should do more, but they choose to live where they do. It's awful, but just deal with it. Well,
where do you expect us to all live? The north is we do have electricity sometimes when it's on, but I'm sure that all Pauline wants is somebody from the government visibly to be coming out and saying, look, we're aware of this situation, it's an emergency, we're doing that. But they're not doing it enough. Clearly, Pauline is dissatisfied, and we are not seeing it enough.
Final text, well, actually it isn't the final text question, but an important text question. Paul in Belfast, should the UK be getting involved in war with Russia? I think we probably all say we don't want the UK to be involved with war with Russia, but what should the response be to this Russian threat on the border with Ukraine? Jonathan?
Well, there's clearly no appetite for physical intervention and physical involvement, so we have to rely on diplomatic and economic sanctions. It seems a bit inadequate. Because we would, part of us would just like to stand up to Russia, and I just wonder, what on earth is Russia afraid of? Why do they feel this need to attack?
Because Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union, doesn't he? Basically, that's what he never thought it should have been divided up, and so bit by bit he wants to reunite it.
Yes, Andrew? Well, it's
I think
empire building, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's definitely part of it. I think as well we shouldn't forget that the US has been stationing bases surrounding Russia. It's been doing the same with China as well, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that these countries are going to stand up to that and say, well, no, they've lost their buffer zone. For years, the US used to beat the living daylights out of South America, and that was its kind of zone of where it could do what it wants and overthrow governments willy-nilly. And Russia used to do that in Eastern Europe and the bit that we now call Central Asia. The problem is that...
Well, why is it, though?
There's an aggressive...
We had Richard Bergen on the show last week, who basically couldn't bring himself to criticise anything to do with China and just slagged off America the whole time. You're about to go down that road as well.
I'm not. I started off by condemning Putin. I condemned China earlier in the programme. I've got no problem with doing that. I've got no love for Putin or Russia in any era, to be frank. Its human rights abuses are awful.
The first thing you mentioned was America.
No, the first thing I did was agree with Jonathan's point and say, yes, there's an element of that going on, but we also have to be aware that both around China and Russia, the US is trying to maintain its influence globally by stationing bases in these places, and that is provocative for these countries. That doesn't excuse
Is there a real threat, though, to Russia? Is there any implication that America one day is going to invade Russia?
I don't think it's about that. It's about economic ties and economic power. It's about what your sphere of influence is as a country and whose neighbouring states are open to whose markets. That's what this is about. This is geopolitics.
It's not America, it's NATO, and they're surely just responding to the threat to these other countries from Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, etc.
There's definitely a part of that as well, but there's a lack of diplomacy on both sides, and I think that's the issue. Okay. There's this kind of ramping up of tensions, which will benefit nobody if it gets to the point of war.
Stephen?
I think the real concern is as you say, the Putin long-term ambition, which you mentioned a moment ago. The real concern, of course, is though that in a command state like Russia is. The real problem is going to be that if you have economic and diplomatic sanctions, that's really not going to be very effective. They're already a relatively small economic power in comparison to their size. They are a militaristic power, and actually we may have to consider making sure that the Ukraine's border is better supported if we want to resist that power, because although, like everybody else, one does not want to see any military action, the reality is I think that the Russians are not going to be terribly interested in or terribly worried about economic sanctions.
Okay, India?
Yeah, just very quickly, I agree with everything that you just said earlier on, Ian, and it goes back to what I said about standing up to China and the BBC. There comes a point when people do have to make a stand, and it looks very grim from the way I'm looking at it here. It might be Crimea now, but I can see Poland going in the future as well. I think that's how expansionist he is. He wants the Soviet Union back, and that's his plan. There is no appetite in the West to stand up to him.
Emily in Leeds texts, I've been watching on Global Player and cannot believe Andrew Fisher is as old as he is, brackets 42. What is the secret of looking so young? Dean in Bromley has got the answer to the question. Oh. Andrew Fisher and Owen Jones both look extremely young. Is socialism the secret to youth?
Must be.
You're looking vaguely embarrassed.
No, it's just the reflection of my marine jumper, I'm sure.
Or maybe the secret is being out of power.
Oh.
No,
He'd probably trade being a bit older or looking on that basis.
So are we going to find out how old you are, Stephen? So
it's a matter of public record.
Go on then.
I was born on the 4th of February 1962.
So you're 3 months older than me. That makes you 59.
Awful, isn't it?
17 years.
Yeah, so completely
ahead
wrong.
Well, on that happy note, thank you very much to you all, Stephen Hammond, India Willoughby, Jonathan Romain and Andrew Fisher. We'll have another edition of Cross Question for you tomorrow night on LBC. Coming up after 9, we're going to take your calls on your reaction to this leaked video about the Downing Street Christmas party that either did or didn't happen. Well, it did, didn't it, frankly? 0345 6060 973. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, a leaked video appears to show Downing Street staff joking about holding a Christmas party last December, while much of the